different sections. Building peace in a society in which human rights are fully enforced means that one must curtail the criminal activities of criminal gangs and their members. Some of them are linked to producing and trafficking illicit narcotics. And that's why the policy for dismantling criminal gangs and adopting a new drugs policy is vital. It will have a human rights-based approach and will seek to protect and ensure the rights of persons and communities who have seen their rights violated as a result of the war against drugs. And at the same time, the aim of this policy is to hold the true criminals accountable for the profits that they are making through the illegal drugs market. This is a transnational issue, so we reiterate Colombia's call to recast the global drug policy, which hasn't achieved its goals over the past 50 years. Furthermore, we welcome the recommendations which support our action in the area of human security for reducing inequality and discrimination, caring for migrants, protecting the LGBTQI+ community, gender equality, gender-based violence prevention, the rights of children, social justice, and safeguards for protecting women leaders, human rights defenders, indigenous groups, the Afro-Colombian community and Roma community. These are all ways of ensuring the enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights for all. This is part of the government's national agenda and the National Development Plan for 2022-2026. Children have a right to be able to go to school in peace and safety. That's absolutely vital, and that's why Colombia has acceded to the Safe Schools Declaration. In recent years, Colombia has faced the challenges of high migratory flows, and it has chosen to respond to them with a human rights-based approach. This is why we've accepted the recommendations concerning migrants' rights, because they are in line with our migratory policies, which do not criminalize migrants for merely having migrated and do not apply to detention measures for having migrated, especially when it comes to migrant children. Colombia would like to reiterate its commitment to multilateralism and its firm belief on the Universal Periodic Review providing a unique opportunity to promote dialogue, find consensus, and identify and exchange good practices with the aim of overcoming human rights challenges which are faced by all states. The administration of President Gustavo Petro has made reactivating the standing invitation to special procedures a priority. Previous governments failed to honour that standing invitation. So that's why we are pleased to accept the recommendations related to work and cooperation with human rights councils, rapporteurs and experts. 2 visits were conducted during 2023 and 5 more are planned for this year. Furthermore, we will continue to respond to outstanding visit requests. Between 2010 and 2022, which was when the current administration took office, there were some 27 requests for visits. They were not authorized, and that deprived our country of their guidance and also harmed the rights of the victims of human rights violations. So over the past 20 years, the Colombian government has failed to honor its standing invitation. The Colombian constitution attaches special importance to human rights treaties which have been signed and ratified by Colombia, on the basis of which these international instruments are of the utmost importance for defending and promoting human rights. This is why we have accepted the recommendations concerning the ratification of the following international instruments: the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, This instrument is currently before the National Congress. Then the Kampala amendments to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court concerning the crime of aggression. The Convention on Combating Discrimination in Education, the Optional Protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Optional Protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on a Communications Procedure, and the Inter-American Convention Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, and Related Forms of Intolerance. In addition to the recommendations accepted, and this will bring me to the end of my opening remarks, President, Colombia is assuming the following voluntary commitments. One, to create a follow-up mechanism on recommendations made and adopting measures for their implementation, and this will be through dialogue with human rights entities. And we will spare no effort for implementing our public policy and action plan for dismantling criminal outfits with a view to pursuing those outfits which are behind the serious violations of the rights of human rights defenders and signatories of the peace agreement. C, we will strengthen the policies to guarantee the right to life, integrity, and the work of human rights defenders and social leaders. And through the special jurisdiction for peace, we will impose penalties on the perpetrators of hostage takers, hostage taking, abductions, killings, and disappearances, which were presented as fallen combatants by state agents and are known as the false positives. We will supervise the enforcement of the sanctions imposed in the framework of transitional justice, and we will bring charges through the special jurisdiction for peace against the perpetrators of the most serious and emblematic crimes committed during the armed conflict, most of them through the open mega cases. And G will strengthen the dissemination of human rights amongst the Colombian population in the framework of the agreement signed between the OHCHR country office in Colombia and the public media system RTVC. Thank you very much, President. I would like to thank you, Ambassador, for that very detailed presentation. I would now like to give the floor to members of the Council and observers for their comments. Speaking time is set at 1 minute 30 seconds for all, and the first speaker is the distinguished delegation of Bolivia. You have the floor. Thank you, Vice President. The plurinational state of Bolivia bids the most cordial welcome to the delegation from Colombia. We thank Colombia for its sincerity during the dialogue in the fourth cycle of the UPR, and we'd also like to thank the Troika for their support to these procedures. We commend Colombia on assessing so many of the 231 recommendations, and they and your remarks this afternoon, Ambassador, show your firm commitment to the UPR. We're pleased to see that Colombia supported Bolivia's recommendations. We do hope that this will foster progress to implementing the peace agreement and the work of the Commission on the Clarification of Truth, which was established last year. The National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security will provide funds for reducing inequality, racial discrimination and discrimination against indigenous peoples. We reiterate Bolivia's support to the Colombian government for efforts in this area and ensuring the protection of all rights for all. We support the report on Colombia's position on the recommendations, and we wish you every success in implementing the recommendations you have accepted. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I'll give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Brazil. Thank you very much, President. Brazil congratulates Colombia on its successful Universal Periodic Review. You have accepted the vast majority of recommendations, over 96% of them in all. We particularly welcome your renewed commitments made during the UPR to further work towards promoting and protecting the rights of vulnerable groups, minorities, including the LGBTQI+ community and indigenous peoples. We congratulate Colombia on promoting women's role in consolidating peace and gender mainstreaming in national policies, as well as efforts to promote empowerment and political participation. We welcome the dialogue between Colombia and the ELN. Brazil will support your efforts for achieving lasting total peace in Colombia. We wish Colombia every success in implementing accepted recommendations during the fourth cycle of the UPR. Thank you very much. Thank you, Brazil. I now call on the distinguished delegation of Chile. We welcome the Colombian delegation, and we're pleased to see that Colombia accepted almost all the 231 recommendations made during the fourth cycle. This reflects the constructive spirit which should prevail. We're pleased to see that Chile's recommendations were accepted, particularly our recommendation on ensuring reparation and holistic care to the victims of gender-based and sexual violence. We also welcome your commitment to combat impunity for cases of murder of human rights defenders. We hope that implementation of accepted recommendations will enable Colombia to make progress to promote, protect, and safeguard human rights. And at the same time, this will help support your policies of peace and security and dismantling illegal outfits in your countries as part of implementing peace agreement. We praise you for your cooperation with United Nations entities, and we wish you every success in implementing these recommendations. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of China.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We commend Colombia's active participation in the UPR and welcome its efforts and achievements in promoting and protecting human rights. Colombia has taken measures to maintain peace and stability in the country, to actively promote economic and social development, to effectively protect the rights of specific groups such as women, children, and persons with disabilities, to promote the development of healthcare and education, and has achieved positive results in combating human trafficking and sexual violence. All these achievements merit recognition. We appreciate Colombia's acceptance of our recommendations on promoting sustainable economic and social development, narrowing the development gap between urban and rural areas, and promoting construction of a social security system. We look forward to the realization of sustainable economic and social development in Colombia to enable the people there to better enjoy all human rights. We wish Colombia greater achievements in the protection and promotion of human rights. China supports the adoption of Colombia's UPR report by the Council. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Cuba. Thank you very much, Vice President. We welcome the Colombian delegation, particularly Ambassador Gullón, and we appreciate your frank participation in this exercise. This was reflected in the interaction we had with your delegation during the dialogue. We're pleased to see that Cuba's 3 recommendations have been accepted, notably with a view to safeguarding the rights and interests of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities and pursuing national strategies for promoting equal labor opportunities between women and men, and for promoting legal instruments for strengthening the protection of human rights. We're pleased to see that you have accepted 223 out of the total of 231 recommendations received. This is an opportunity for improving in the areas which you have made a priority for your human rights action. Lastly, we wish Colombia every success in implementing the accepted recommendations, and we support the adoption of your report. We'd also like to convey Cuba's undying support for the peace process in Colombia. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation to France.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. France thanks the Colombian delegation and greets it. We'd like to thank you for the additional information provided to the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review. We commend Colombia on having accepted almost all recommendations received from member states, in particular 4 out of France's 5 recommendations. France recognizes the Colombian government's strong commitment for respecting, protecting and promoting the human rights and those of human rights defenders. France continues to stand alongside Colombia in its efforts to put a stop to one of the longest conflicts in our history and to build lasting peace, which has caused one of the largest number of victims in modern history. We support your efforts to build lasting peace throughout the country. Thank you, distinguished ambassador. I'd now like to give the floor to the delegation of India.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. India warmly welcomes the delegation of Colombia for the adoption of the report of the Working Group on its 4th cycle of the Universal Periodic Review held on 7th November 2023. The review saw substantive and constructive participation with over 230 recommendations. We appreciate the constructive engagement of the delegation of Colombia during the entire review, which reflects their commitment to the UPR process. India expresses appreciation for the engagement of Colombia with various human rights mechanisms. This is also reflected in their accepting 223 recommendations in their 4th UPR. While recommending the adoption of their UPR report, we wish Colombia success in their efforts to implement the accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to give the floor to the delegation of Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Maldives warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Colombia to the adoption of the UPR outcome report. We commend Colombia for accepting 223 recommendations out of the 231 recommendations received during its 4th cycle of the UPR held on 7th November 2023. My delegation notes with appreciation that the government of Colombia has accepted both the recommendations made by Maldives to strengthen access to education and enhance the retention rate of girls in school and in higher education institutions, and to intensify efforts to ensure that victims of gender-based violence have access to justice and other specialized services. The Maldives recommends the adoption of the UPR report of Colombia by consensus and wishes the government of Colombia every success in the implementation of the accepted recommendation. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished ambassador of Nepal.
Mr. Vice President, Nepal welcomes the delegation of Colombia to the adoption of the UPR outcome and appreciates them for the constructive engagement in the UPR process. We thank Colombia for accepting almost all recommendations, including our 2 recommendations. We take positive note of the continuous engagement of Colombia with the special procedure mandate holder and treaty parties. The strengthening of the Reintegration Council and the reformulation of National Culture Plan to protect diversity of the life and land is praiseworthy. National Human Rights Strategy, as well as recent ratification of various human rights instruments, is appreciable. We recommend the Council to adopt the UPR document of Colombia by consensus, and Nepal wishes Colombia all success in implementing the accepted recommendations. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Philippines warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Colombia. The Philippine delegation commends Colombia for upholding the significance of the UPR process as a constructive mechanism in advancing the promotion and protection of human rights, as manifested by its acceptance of 223 out of 231 recommendations made by various delegations. We congratulate Colombia's peace-building and human rights strengthening efforts by firmly carrying out the framework plan for implementation of the final peace agreement and the National Human Rights Strategy. In closing, Mr. Vice President, the Philippines joins the other delegations in recommending the adoption of the UPR Working Group report on Colombia and wishes the government of Colombia success in the implementation of all accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I call on the distinguished delegation of the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Mr. President, the Russian delegation is pleased to note that Colombia has accepted all of the recommendations made by Russia on thorough investigation of cases of abuse of authority by law enforcement personnel and bringing perpetrators to justice, as well as adopting a set of effective measures to improving the situation in the prison system, measures to ensure access by the indigenous people to social infrastructure, education and healthcare. At the same time, despite some progress in human rights, the general human rights situation in the country remains complex. We hope that Colombia's adoption of the recommendations during the GPR will be properly implemented, and this will make it possible to overcome failings in human rights in the country. Russia recommends adopting the report on Colombia's fourth UPR. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished delegation of South Africa.
Mr. Vice President, South Africa congratulates Colombia on the successful outcome of its UPR session held on 7 November 2023. We commend Colombia for its constructive engagement in the UPR process and welcome its positive response on 223 of the 231 recommendations received during its fourth UPR cycle. South Africa further expresses its appreciation to Colombia for accepting its recommendations, namely to include gender and ethnic indicators to assess progress on all measures envisaged under the framework plan for the implementation of the peace agreement, to increase awareness of and provide training on the guidelines for criminal prosecution of domestic violence and the approach to be adopted in cases of femicides and offenses of human trafficking for sexual exploitation, and to consider ratifying the international human rights treaties that it has not yet ratified. South Africa encourages Colombia to bolster efforts to ensure that all health personnel are aware of and apply the Constitutional Court judgment decriminalizing the voluntary termination of pregnancy, and to consider eliminating the offense of abortion from the criminal code. We wish Colombia every success in implementing the recommendations from the UPR session and request the Council to adopt Colombia's UPR outcomes. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I call on Sri Lanka by video.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka appreciates the constructive engagement of Colombia with this Council during its fourth cycle of the UPR. We appreciate that Colombia has accepted 223 recommendations out of the total 231 received from members and observer states of this Council, including the 2 recommendations by Sri Lanka. We take note of Colombia's continued commitment to promote rights of the child and encourage continued measures to be taken to safeguard the welfare of children, including access to schools. Sri Lanka recommends the adoption of the 4th UPR report of Colombia and wishes success in its implementation. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished delegation of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Trinidad and Tobago welcomes the delegation of Colombia to the adoption of the UPR outcome. We congratulate Colombia on its constructive engagement throughout this 4th cycle of the UPR process. Of the 231 recommendations received during its review, Colombia has accepted 223, including a recommendation made by Trinidad and Tobago. Also noteworthy are the voluntary pledges and commitments made by Colombia, which aim in part to strengthen peace building. These actions send a strong signal of Colombia's continued commitment and willingness to pursue the promotion and protection of human rights at the national level. Recognizing the wide-ranging efforts made by Colombia, including through its ongoing engagement with the OHCHR, Trinidad and Tobago takes the opportunity to wish Colombia every success in its implementation of the accepted recommendations arising from this review, and we recommend the adoption of the report. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on UN Women by video message.
I would like to congratulate Colombia for the efforts made to advance gender equality, especially the inclusion of gender provisions in the Havana's peace agreement, the creation of the first Ministry for Equality in the history of the country, the process of formulation of the first National Action Plan on 1325 resolution on women, peace and security, or the development of the first feminist foreign policy in the country. As UN Women, we will continue providing technical assistance to strengthen the implementation of the existing regulatory framework and supporting gender budgeting as an essential tool to advance the gender equality agenda, to support the policies to fight violence against women, and to guarantee a comprehensive protection of women survivors and human rights defenders, and to promote the closing of the gender gaps in women's political and economic participation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Gracias.
Thank you. That was the last state speaker that we could take from our list. As you know, all statements, including those which could not be delivered during time constraints, should be uploaded online. I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments on the outcome. The speaking time has been set at 2 minutes for all, and I call on the Akahata Association. Thank you, President. Akahata makes a statement on behalf of Red Tressex and the Initiative for Sexual Rights. We welcome Colombia's commitment to the UPR mechanism. However, we are concerned that the information and recommendations that we sent have not been addressed at this review, and thus there have not been recommendations related to the rights of sex workers. Our contribution pointed to arbitrary detention and other abuses, discrimination in obtaining access to rights, and violence suffered with impunity for the aggressors. The Association for Sex Work and Trafficking, the Association of Sex Work and Trafficking, or the use of concept of prostitution are wrongful approaches and allow violations of our rights. Sex workers exercise their right to bodily autonomy and work. However, on a daily basis, our rights are violated, undermining our integrity, our freedom, and in many cases, threatening our lives. We call on the State of Colombia, this council and its mechanisms, as well as states members, to take the necessary measures to protect the rights of sex workers and recognize our work from an intersectional perspective and a human rights-based approach. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I call on Women's International League for Peace. Thank you. The Colombian section of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom welcomes the Colombian government's support to the UPR recommendations 11626 and 11633 on redoubling efforts for the effective implementation of the final peace agreement, especially its gender measures. Some of the measures to be accelerated are increase the budget allocation for gender measures by at least 50%. In 2020 and 2021, it was only 3% of the national budget. Accelerate the updating and implementation of the gender indicators of the framework plan for the implementation of the final peace agreement, ensuring the inclusion of impact indicators aimed at ensuring significant changes in women's lives. 3, allocate specific resources for the implementation of the comprehensive program for safeguards for women leaders and human rights defenders and expand its coverage. 4, establish clear mechanisms for women's participation and guarantee their participation in social control and public oversight mechanisms. 5, promote more effective transparency and accountability mechanisms. 6, within the framework of the first National Action Plan for UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the policy of total peace, guarantee the effective and full participation of women in all diversity in the various peace negotiations and the processes for bringing perpetrators to justice. Thank you. Thank you. I call on Lawyers for Lawyers by video.
Mr. President, Lawyers for Lawyers welcomes the decision of Colombia to accept many of the recommendations concerning the protection of human rights defenders, including lawyers, and the effective investigation into the attacks and threats against them. We call upon Colombia to effectively implement them without delay. Lawyers for Lawyers continues to be concerned about the increasing number of reported threats and attacks against human rights lawyers in Colombia. When representing their clients, lawyers have seen continued harassment in the form of verbal intimidation, threatening phone calls, physical and social media threats, and incidents of physical and verbal assault. These attacks, predominantly perpetrated by third parties, are met with insufficient government action to prevent or address them effectively. Furthermore, it has been reported that lawyers have been subject to unlawful surveillance activities carried out by the Colombian National Army, which threaten their security, work, and personal lives. In some cases, this has even led to assassination attempts and murders. Lawyers play a vital role in the protection of the rule of law and human rights. Their work is indispensable for ensuring effective access to justice for all. To fulfill their professional duties effectively, lawyers should be able to practice law freely and independently without any fear of reprisals. Therefore, we urge Colombia to promptly implement adequate safeguards, both in law and in practice, to ensure the effective protection of lawyers from any form of retaliation in connection to their professional activities. We also call upon the Colombian authorities to cease any harassment of lawyers and avoid any undue interferences in their work, such as illegal surveillance. Lastly, we urge Colombia to immediately adopt measures guaranteeing the prompt, effective, and independent investigation of all human rights violations against human rights defenders, including lawyers, and hold them accountable. Thank you.
Gracias. Por video.
Thank you. I call on Peace Brigades International by video. Thank you. We welcome the statement by the government regarding implementation of the peace agreement of 2016 and other peace-building initiatives. We echo the many recommendations on preventing harm against human rights defenders and protecting them with a collective differentiated approach. We regret the lack of progress in real dismantling of the structures that are successes to the paramilitaries and continue to act on the ground, killing human rights defenders and carrying out acts of violence. The adoption of the policy to dismantle by the National Guarantees Commission is a step forward, but there are still no immediate action plans to implement it and stop the violence. A painful example of this violence is the double killing on 19th of March, affecting a woman and a child who belonged to the peace community of San José de Apartado, an emblematic, internationally recognized community in Urabá. Despite the many complaints, state action to prevent the double killing was ineffective. The measures of the peace agreement, such as the land-based development plans, are not making proper progress. Dismantling the successors to the paramilitaries means making more progress and no further delays in genuine investigation of the links of armed groups with political, economic, and military elites. In various parts of the country, such as Magdalena Medio, Putumayo, or Valle de Cauca, we hear concerns about the expansion of armed groups, including the Autodefensas Gaitanistas, which continue to threaten, kill, confine, and silence the ethnic and peasant communities, as well as recruiting young people, raping girls and women, and fighting for control of the land.
Gracias.
Thank you. I call on the World Jewish Congress by video.
Thank you, Mr. President. As the Executive Director of the Confederation of Jewish Communities of Colombia, I'm honored to take the floor on behalf of the World Jewish Congress. The Colombian Jews form a strong community of 7,000 people and enjoy an extremely rich and joyful community life. The community enjoys all constitutional rights of the country and has had the chance to develop and grow stronger over the years. We appreciate the fact that anti-Semitism is recognized in the criminal code, and Colombia adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism in 2022. The community is also grateful for the cooperation with the government, particularly through such initiatives as social assistance in various regions of the country and as active members of the Religious Directorate of the Ministry of Interior. However, issues of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and Israel-related anti-Semitism continue to be of concern to the Jewish community, especially since October 7, terror attacks by Hamas, as we have seen a strong growth of hate speech, especially in social networks. We recommend the government to join the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance as soon as possible and urge it to maintain working diplomatic relations with the State of Israel. We remain vigilant on the matter of anti-Semitism and racism, as well as on the respect of human rights, which must be strictly guaranteed both in Colombia and all over the world. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada.
Mr. President, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, with the endorsement of the Columbia Caravana, welcomes Colombia's support for recommendations made at its fourth UPR concerning the rights and protections of lawyers and human rights defenders. LRWC also recognizes points B and C of Colombia's volunteer commitments and urges it to take meaningful and measurable steps to dismantle the criminal structures behind serious rights violations. Urgent measures are needed to strengthen policies that guarantee effective protection of the lives and work of human rights defenders. In particular, Colombia must address the widespread historical and recent failures of the National Protection Unit to provide timely, flexible, differentiated, or adequate measures to at-risk human rights defenders. Protection measures must not place these defenders at greater risk, and much-needed existing measures must not be removed. The Columbia Caravana, an international delegation of jurists, recently received and documented numerous testimonies about the National Protection Unit's failures to respond to high-risk situations, undue delays in granting protection, and illegitimate denials of protection measures, including measures ordered by the Inter-American Human Rights System. To facilitate prompt, impartial, and effective investigations into attacks on human rights defenders and to address the impunity surrounding these crimes, Colombia must provide sufficient resources to the judiciary, the Attorney General's office, and to the units responsible for investigating crimes and human rights violations. We call on the Council to insist that Colombia implements improvements in the funding and provision of protective mechanisms and incorporates gender-sensitive protection measures that cover the family members of rights defenders, improves the efficiency of the Committee for Risk Assessment and Recommendation of Protective Measures by streamlining its processes, and adopts measures to promote timely, impartial investigations and complaints of threats and attacks. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on the International Lesbian Gay Association.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. In recent years, Colombia has made considerable progress in recognizing the rights of LGBT persons, but there is a risk of backsliding. We welcome the fact in the fourth cycle, Colombia accepted all the recommendations made on the rights of that group. We welcome the commitment expressed by the state to create a mechanism to follow up the recommendations adopted and adopt measures for application working with civil society. It is positive that Colombia stated that it is making progress in creating and strengthening actions for the LGBTI population, including the creation of a directorate for LGBTIQ affairs in the Ministry of Equality, and action to follow up violence against their persons of their group, as well as cultural transformation. However, the situation of LGBTI persons in Colombia is still alarming. In 2022, there were 107 cases of police violence, 148 killings, 10 against human rights defenders, and 181 cases of threats against LGBTIQ plus persons, 52 of them human rights defenders. This is an example of the continuing violence against that group. We note the importance of the recognition by most countries of the efforts of Colombia for peace and the call on Colombia for measures to be taken, including the Comprehensive System for Peace and gender and ethnic measures. We welcome the recommendations by Chile, Czech Republic, Iceland, Ireland, Montenegro, Netherlands, USA, Argentina, and Uruguay, who called on Colombia to improve the situation with discrimination. We continue to count on you as allies to protect the rights of the LGBTIQ plus population in Colombia. Thank you. Thank you. I call on IIMA.
Señor Presidente.
President, we welcome the recommendations by states for Colombia in this fourth cycle. The calls for prevention of violence against women, the recommendations on protection of minors, and other recommendations will drive measures to improve the human rights situation. We are concerned at the splinter state of the paramilitaries, which has been carrying out attacks on the Nasa people and killed its leader, Carmelina Ure, who was trying to stop the forced recruitment of a child from the community. We're concerned at the rise in violence. To show international support and to call for urgent implementation, we welcome the more than 20 recommendations on the application of the peace agreement of 2016 and on progress in building peace in Colombia. We welcome the state's decision to accept the majority of the over 200 recommendations and commit to creating a mechanism for follow-up. We hope that this will soon be translated into reality and ensure participation by civil society and fulfillment of the recommendations. Thank you.
Acabamos de...
That was the Colombian Commission of Jurists. I now call on IIMA.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. On behalf of a coalition of NGOs, we thank Colombia for its participation in this fourth cycle of the UPR and accepting the majority of the recommendations. We recognize Colombia's efforts for a better access to education and its acceptance of the recommendations 116, 136, 137, 138, and 139. We are, however, concerned that indigenous children and those in rural and marginalized areas are still being discriminated in terms of access to quality education. We also regret the fact that recommendation 1169 was not accepted, since educational centers should be entirely committed to providing a safe space to students and preventing school dropout arising from discrimination. On eradication of violence, we recognize the measures taken by Colombia, especially the National Plan Against Violence Facing Children to 2024, and welcome the adoption of the recommendations 116, 158, 167, 174, and 177. However, we are gravely concerned at the rise of violence in Colombia, especially against children, adolescents, and women. We respectfully recommend that Colombia consider ratifying the UNESCO Convention on Combating Discrimination in Education and step up awareness campaigns on non-discrimination in educational facilities. Strengthen measures to ensure the right to education for indigenous children and those living in rural and marginalized areas. And step up efforts to prevent, investigate, and criminalize cases of violence, especially domestic and sexual violence against children, adolescents, and women. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And by video message, we now have the Global Lutheran World Foundation.
World Federation, at its member church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Colombia, appreciates the work that has been done by the State of Colombia during the 4th review under the UPR. Based on the findings of our accompaniment of community in 5 regions of the country, we present the following recommendations. We recommend a robust compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law for all actors in the armed conflict. We propose promotion of public policies to prevent forced requirement, particularly for children into armed groups. Advise all stakeholders must promote protective environments for children at the family, schools, and institutional levels, and guarantee access to the right to food, water, education, and health service for children. We further recommend that the Colombian Congress speed up the approval of the legislation to prohibit child marriage. We recommend the creation of new comprehensive support structures for women who are victims of violence. We recommend correcting the shortcomings of the seeking structures to achieve silent care, security guarantee, and avoid re-victimization. It is necessary to ensure access to justice, the right of life, sexual health, and work for women through training programs, care, and psychosocial support. We call on the Colombian government to expedite the regularization mechanisms for migrants and to create care and protection programs for migrants and for their host communities in order to guarantee us access to fundamental rights such as food, housing, work, health, and legal advice to those who require. Finally, we recommend that the Colombian government provides timely protection to social leaders and human rights defenders. We suggest a review of the efficiency of existing support structure. It is particularly important to guarantee the protection and rights of ex-combatants who have laid down their arms and have adopted the political solution to the armed conflict in Colombia. This is fundamental for the success of the current and future peace dialogues in the country. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Distinguished colleagues, that was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Before giving the floor to the delegation of Colombia for concluding remarks, allow me to note that, that of the 231 recommendations received, 223 enjoy the support of Colombia and 8 are noted. I now
Corrijo.
I would like to correct. The ambassador is, I'm sorry, the ambassador is always attentive. 8 are noted and there are 6 voluntary commitments. So with that, I will give the floor to His Excellency for concluding remarks.
Tiene la palabra.
You have the floor. Thank you, President and distinguished ambassador. Colombia is attentive to the comments made at this last segment. The striving of my country is to implement its human rights commitments. I want once more to thank the Human Rights Council and its distinguished members and observers, the Office of the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights, the special procedures, the human rights treaty bodies, the United Nations agencies on human rights and humanitarian affairs, and the civil society organizations for their attention to the human rights situation in Colombia and the issues that are affecting our society, as well as their support to our efforts to overcome these and substantially reduce and we hope eliminate the high levels of socio-political violence, impunity and social exclusion which we have had and we continue to see in our country. With your support and your critical and constructive approach, we will achieve this. We have to achieve this. It is a crucial element in decency, respect, and humanity. Thank you, Vice President. I thank His Excellency for this presentation and for the very constructive participation of Colombia throughout this UPR process. I now propose that the Council adopt a decision on the outcome of the UPR of Colombia as it appears on the screen.
No veo.
I see no objection. The decision is adopted. We will briefly suspend the meeting before moving on to consider the outcome of Uzbekistan. Thank you.